The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1879, smelling faintly of cedar and ink, addressed to a man Adelaide Winslow had never laid eyes on but had somehow, inexplicably, come to love. Adelaide stood behind the long wooden counter of the Harding Creek post office, which also served as the general store, the notary office, and on certain desperate Sundays, the closest thing to a church that the small Wyoming Territory town could muster. She was 23 years old. With dark chestnut hair she kept pinned up beneath a calico bonnet most days, and brown eyes the color of good river mud after a rain. She was not the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. She was the kind of woman who, once you noticed her, you could not stop watching, because there was something in the way she moved through the world, deliberate and careful and quietly burning, that made you feel like she was the only real thing in it. The letter was from Fort Laramie, addressed to one Grant Warren, care of the Harding Creek Post Office and General Store, Harding Creek, Wyoming Territory. She set it on the shelf behind her with the others. There were 47 of them now. The story of how it began was not complicated, but it was the kind of story that sounds impossible until you understand the particular loneliness of a small Wyoming town in the late 1870s, and the particular kind of woman Adelaide Winslow was. Her father, Thomas Winslow, had run the post office and general store since she was a girl. Her mother had died of fever when Adelaide was 14, and her father had followed 3 years later, leaving her the store, a small debt, and a stubbornness she wore like armor. She was 20 years old when she took over the counter, and she was good at it. She knew every family in the county, knew which ranchers were running behind on their seed money, knew which wives were quietly desperate, and which children needed a piece of hard candy slipped into their coat pockets when their parents weren't looking. The letters to Grant Warren had started arriving in the winter of 1876. The first one came from a woman in Missouri named Clara, who wrote in a looping, hopeful hand that she had seen his notice in the Matrimonial Times and found his description of himself as a man of honest character and moderate means quite appealing. She asked him to write back at his earliest convenience. Adelaide had set it on the shelf. No response came. A second letter arrived 6 weeks later, also from Clara, now sounding somewhat less hopeful and somewhat more pointed. Adelaide set that one beside the first, then a third, from a different woman in Ohio, then one from Kansas, then a long, careful letter from a widow in Tennessee who wrote beautifully about the loneliness of prairie winters and the smell of wood smoke in the evenings. No man named Grant Warren ever came in to collect them. Adelaide waited 3 months, which was longer than the official policy required, and then she wrote a forwarding notice to the address given on the original return slips. She sent it to a ranch outside Cheyenne that a letter had once listed as his place of employment. The notice came back unopened, marked with a single word scrawled in pencil, "Gone." So the letter sat, and Adelaide, who had never been one to idle, found herself doing something she could not entirely explain. One evening in February of 1877, after the store was closed and the oil lamp threw orange light across the shelves of flour and tobacco and calico, she sat down at the counter and she wrote to Grant Warren herself. She did not tell him about the letters waiting for him. She told him, instead, about Harding Creek. About the way the cottonwoods along the creek bed went yellow in the fall, and how they rustled like distant applause when the wind moved through them. She told him about old Mabel Greaves, who was 91 years old and still rode her mule to town every Saturday to argue with Adelaide about the price of salt pork. She told him about the Comanche star quilt that hung in the window of her store, made by a woman named Rosa Vasquez, who had married a rancher named Pete and brought her traditions north with her, and how the colors of that quilt changed entirely depending on the time of day you looked at it. She addressed the letter to Grant Warren, whereabouts unknown, and sent it to the last known address in Cheyenne, not really expecting a response. She got one. It came 6 weeks later, written on paper that had clearly been folded and carried for some time before being sent, in a hand that was bold and somewhat uneven, as if the writer was more accustomed to holding reins than a pen. He wrote, "Miss Winslow, I am not sure how your letter reached me, as I have not been at the Cheyenne address for some time, but a man who owed me a favor was kind enough to forward it. I should tell you that I did not place any notice in any matrimonial paper, and I am not in search of a wife, so if you are writing on behalf of some arrangement, I am grateful for your trouble but must respectfully decline. However, your description of Harding Creek made me feel, for the first time in a long time, that somewhere in this territory there is a place that actually belongs to somebody, and I found I wanted to know more about the quilt. Sincerely, Grant Warren." Adelaide read that letter 4 times, then she wrote back. She told him about the quilt in great detail, about Rosa Vasquez and the geometry of the pattern, and the way Rosa had explained that each point of the star represented a direction the soul could travel. She told him that she was not writing on behalf of any matrimonial arrangement, that she was simply a woman who ran a post office and found it impossible to let an address remain entirely unanswered. She told him a little more about Harding Creek, about the winter that had just passed and the cold that could settle into the bones of a building and not leave until April, about the way the town smelled of pine smoke from October through March. She sent it to the Fort Laramie address he'd written from, and she did not know if it would reach him. It did, and so it went, for 3 years. The letters were not love letters, not at first. They were something else entirely, something Adelaide could not name, which made them feel more dangerous and more real. They wrote to each other the way two people might talk on a long porch in the late afternoon when there is nowhere particular to be. They wrote about ordinary things made vivid by the telling. Grant wrote about the land he had crossed and was crossing still, about the quality of light over the Laramie Range at dawn, about a horse named Consequent that he had owned for 6 years and who was, he said, the most opinionated animal he had ever met. He wrote about the men he rode with and the work he did, which was cattle driving and sometimes surveying, and occasionally the kind of odd jobs work that kept a man moving without ever quite letting him stop. He did not write much about his past. Neither did she, not at first. By the 2nd year, the letters had grown longer. Adelaide found herself writing things she had not said aloud to anyone, things about the weight of running the store alone, about the particular loneliness of being the most capable person in a room, and still wishing someone would just once ask if she needed help. She wrote about the injustice she watched play out at the land office 2 doors down, where men with money and connections filed claims on land that had belonged to families for decades, Native families and Mexican families and black homesteaders who had come west under the Homestead Act with the same hope as everyone else, only to find that hope was not distributed evenly in the Wyoming Territory. She wrote about the Vasquez family specifically, about the threats Pete and Rosa had received from a cattle company called the Hollow Creek Consortium that wanted their water rights, and about her own helpless fury at having no legal means to stop it. Grant's response to that letter was different in tone from his usual ones. He wrote, "I have seen what you are describing in a dozen counties and a dozen states, and it is the same story wearing different hats. I want to tell you something about what kind of man I am, so you know whether my letters are worth continuing to read. I am not a man who looks away from that kind of thing. I have not always been able to do anything about it, but I have never been able to make myself look away, and that has cost me work more than once. I think you are the same way. I think that is why you wrote to a stranger in the first place, because looking away is something you are constitutionally unable to do." Adelaide read that paragraph standing at the counter in the middle of a busy Thursday morning, and she had to turn away from the customers and press her hand briefly to her mouth before she could compose herself. She wrote back that she thought he might be right. She wrote back that she had never had anyone describe her to herself before, and that it was a strange and entirely welcome feeling. She wrote back that she was, she supposed, constitutionally unable to look away, and that it had cost her too, in the way that a small-town woman who asked too many questions and filed too many written complaints with the land office, and was known to have opinions, was quietly and consistently the last one invited to the social gatherings that mattered. He wrote back, "Then I think you are the bravest person I correspond with, and I correspond with 3 people, so that is not nothing." She laughed out loud when she read that, alone in the store on a Wednesday evening, and the sound surprised her. By the 3rd year, the letters had become something she counted on the way she counted on the sun coming up. She had arranged the ones he sent in a cedar box her father had made, wrapped in a length of blue ribbon. She did not examine too carefully what that meant. She knew what it meant. She had known for a long time what it meant, but there was something comfortable in the not examining, something safe about loving a man who existed only in careful handwriting on worn paper, who could not leave her the way her mother had left and her father had left, and the town itself seemed always to be quietly leaving, people moving on to other territories, other lives, other distances. She had never told him she loved him. She had never written anything that was precisely a declaration. But she had written, in a letter sent in January of 1879, that she had dreamed about the sound of his voice and woken up sad because she didn't know what it actually sounded like, and that she thought that was the strangest grief she had ever had, missing the voice of someone she'd never heard. He had written back within 2 weeks, which was faster than usual. He wrote, "Adelaide, I have been sitting with your letter for 10 days trying to figure out how to answer it honestly. Here is the honest answer. I think about Harding Creek the way other men think about home, which means I think about it the way I think about you, because the two are the same thing in my head now. I don't say this to complicate what we have, which is something I value more than I can easily put into words. I say it because you told me you missed something you'd never heard, and I think you deserve to know that I understand that, because I have been missing something I have never seen, and I am reasonably certain that something is you." Adelaide had read that letter 6 times. She had then gone out to the back of the store and stood in the cold evening air for a long while, looking at the mountains. She had written back, "Then maybe you should come to Harding Creek." That letter had been sent in February. It was now the 1st of April, 1879, and the letter she was holding, the one addressed from Fort Laramie and smelling of cedar and ink, was not one she was holding for someone else. It was addressed to her. She opened it carefully. He wrote, "I think I will. Look for me in the spring." It was the shortest letter he had ever sent. It was also the most terrifying thing she had ever read. She set it down on the counter. She picked it up again. She set it down again. Old Cal Brannigan, who came in every morning for tobacco and was 64 years old and deeply uninterested in other people's business, watched her do this and said, without looking up from the wheel of cheese he was examining, "You all right, Adelaide?" "Fine," she said. "Perfectly fine." "You're the color of something that's been left in a drawer," he said. "I'm fine, Cal." He bought his tobacco and left. Adelaide stood at the counter for a long time after that, looking at the letter, looking at the door, looking at the mountains through the window. Look for me in the spring. It was spring. The weeks that followed were some of the longest of Adelaide's life. She found herself doing things she would ordinarily have found ridiculous, checking her hair in the small mirror she kept behind the counter, wondering if the dress she wore on Tuesdays was better than the one she wore on Wednesdays, lying awake at night constructing entire conversations in her head, and then dismantling them because they sounded nothing like her. She baked a pie and then felt so foolish about it that she gave it to the Henley family across the street before anyone could ask her why she'd baked it. She cleaned the store 3 times. Rosa Vasquez, who came in on Fridays for supplies and had become, over the years, the closest thing Adelaide had to a true friend, noticed immediately. "You look like you are waiting for something," Rosa said, setting her basket on the counter and watching Adelaide with dark, perceptive eyes. "I am always waiting for something," Adelaide said. "I run a post office." "This is different," Rosa said. "You keep looking at the door." Adelaide considered denying it and then decided against it. "There may be someone coming," she said. "Someone I have been corresponding with." Rosa's expression shifted into something warm and knowing and slightly dangerous. "The man," she said. "I beg your pardon. Pete saw your face once when a letter came from that Fort Laramie address," Rosa said calmly. "He said you looked like someone who'd just seen the first green on a tree in March. I told him that was you being happy. He said happiness looked like that. I said yes, for Adelaide it does." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. "He said he was coming in the spring," she said. "In February he said that. And it's April now, and I don't know when in the spring he meant, or if something has happened to him, or if he's changed his mind." Rosa reached across the counter and put her hand over Adelaide's. "He has not changed his mind," she said. "You can tell by the letters. Pete changes his mind about things every 12 minutes, and his letters never have that quality yours does when you tell me what this man writes. There is a difference between a man who writes because it costs him nothing, and a man who writes because it costs him something and he does it anyway." Adelaide took a breath. "What if I don't know what to say to him? What if 3 years of letters and we have nothing to talk about in person because we already said all of it?" Rosa smiled. "You have not said any of it," she said. "You have written it. That is not the same thing. The words still need to be said out loud." Adelaide thought about that for the rest of the day. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in late April with a cold wind coming down from the mountains and a sky the color of pewter, Adelaide was in the middle of inventorying a new shipment of dry goods when she heard boots on the porch steps outside. The door opened. She had her back to it. She was counting bolts of fabric and had 23 in her count and could not lose her place. "I'll be with you in a moment," she said. "Take your time," said a voice she had never heard before. She lost her count entirely. She turned around slowly. He was tall, which she had somehow expected without knowing why. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, cut back from a face that was angular and weathered in the way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors. He had gray eyes, which surprised her. She had imagined brown. She wasn't sure why, and the gray was startling in the way of a sky you thought you knew suddenly doing something unexpected. He was wearing a long canvas duster that was dusty from travel, and he held his hat in both hands in front of him, turning it slowly by the brim, which she recognized as a nervous habit even though she had only just met him. He had a week's worth of beard and he was looking at her like he was trying to make sure she was real. She was doing the same thing. "Adelaide Winslow," he said. It was not quite a question. "Grant Warren," she said. It was not quite an answer. They stood there for a moment, the two of them, on opposite sides of the counter in a small store in a small town in the Wyoming Territory. And Adelaide felt the strangest sensation. Like every letter she had ever written, and every letter she had ever received was present in the room with them, filling the air around them, the way music fills a room when someone finally starts playing after a long silence. "You're taller than I thought," she said finally, because it was true and because she needed to say something. One corner of his mouth moved. "You're younger than I thought," he said. "I'm 23. "I know, you told me. I thought 23 would look older. You're 30. "I know, I told you. "You look it," she said, and then caught herself. "I mean not badly, you just look like what I would have imagined except the eyes." "What about the eyes?" "I thought brown," she said. "I'm not sure why." "Mine were once," he said, and then looked slightly surprised at himself, as if he hadn't meant to say that. She came out from behind the counter. She had not planned to do this. She had in her head imagined a variety of scenarios, and in most of them she remained behind the counter because the counter was familiar and solid and hers, and she met people across it. That was how her life was arranged. But she walked around it and she stopped a few feet from him and she looked at him in the full, close light, and he looked back at her with those gray eyes that were the color of the sky outside, and she said, "You came." "I said I would," he said. "You said spring." "It's spring." "It's barely spring," she said. "There was still frost 3 days ago." "It counts," he said. "I checked," she laughed. It came out before she could stop it, that same surprised sound she'd made alone in the store when he'd told her she was the bravest person he corresponded with, and his whole face changed when she laughed, went warm and open in a way that was entirely different from the careful, composed expression he'd been wearing, and she understood then that he was as nervous as she was. "There's coffee," she said, "if you want it." "I have been riding since before dawn," he said. "I want it very much." She made coffee, and he sat on the other side of the counter on the stool that Cal Brannigan occupied every morning, and they talked. They talked for 3 hours straight, which meant that Adelaide served approximately 4 customers during that time, with a distracted efficiency that left at least one of them deeply confused about the change they received, and she did not particularly care. It was different from the letters, and it was exactly like them. The letters had always moved quickly, jumped from subject to subject with an ease she'd attributed to the particular freedom of writing something down rather than saying it. The conversation had the same quality. He talked about the drive he'd just finished, 200 head from a ranch outside Cheyenne to a buyer in Nebraska, which had taken 3 weeks, and involved one river crossing that he still seemed annoyed about, and a wrangler named Dix Holloway who had apparently complained for the entirety of the journey about a personal grievance against tinned beans that Grant recounted with such precise exasperation that Adelaide had to set down her coffee cup. She told him about Mabel Greaves, who had in fact died the previous November but whose legend lived on in the salt pork dispute that her daughter had now taken up with undiminished ferocity. She told him about the new schoolteacher, a young man from Philadelphia named Arthur Perch, who had arrived with a crate of books and a profound misunderstanding of Wyoming winters, and who had lasted exactly 1 season before returning east, having traded his wool suit for denims and developed a genuine affection for the territory that nobody had expected. And then, naturally, because it was always going to come to this, she told him about Pete and Rosa Vasquez and the Hollow Creek Consortium. The warmth in his expression did not go away exactly, but it sharpened. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had even through letters, the quality of his attention unmistakable. She told him that the consortium had been systematically pressuring small ranchers and homesteaders off land along the Hollow Creek watershed, that their methods were a combination of legal maneuvering and the kind of quiet intimidation that was hard to prove but unmistakable in its effect. That Pete Vasquez had received 3 separate notices from a lawyer in Cheyenne claiming technical violations of his original claim filing, all of which were dubious at best and fraudulent at worst, and that Pete was a good man but not a man who was experienced in legal combat and had no money for a lawyer of his own. Grant was quiet for a moment. "You've written to the land office," he said. He knew she had. He'd read the letters about it. 3 times, she said. The first time they sent a form letter back. The second time nothing. The third time a man came out from Cheyenne and spent 2 days looking at records and then left, and 6 weeks later I got a letter saying the Vasquez filing appeared to be in compliance but that they would continue to monitor the situation. "And the consortium has not stopped," she said. "You know what they're doing," he said. "It's water. It's always water in this territory." "I know," she said. "If they can get the Vasquez water rights, they control the only reliable year-round source within 8 miles on the eastern side of the creek. Every smaller ranch between them and town would eventually have to deal with them on the consortium's terms." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I may know someone," he said. "A man named Elias Cord. He was a claims attorney in Denver before he came west, and he did some legitimate work for a cattle company I drove for 2 years back. He's in Laramie now, I believe, and from what I knew of him, he would find this kind of fight interesting." Adelaide looked at him. "Why would he help?" "Because I'd ask him," Grant said. "And because he is the kind of man who got into law because he believed it meant something, and then spent 15 years finding out how many ways it didn't. And that has left him in a particular mood that makes him easy to motivate on the right kind of case." She studied his face. "You have thought about this," she said. "The Vasquez situation, from the letters." "I have thought about a great many things from the letters," he said, and he said it simply, without dramatics, and looked at her steadily, and she felt the words settle somewhere in her chest like they intended to stay. "Grant," she said. "Adelaide," he said. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. "Why did you really come?" she said. He did not look away. "You know why," he said. "I want to hear it," she said. "I have been reading your words for 3 years, and I want to hear the actual voice say the actual thing." He set his coffee cup down. He looked at her across the counter in the lamplight. This woman he had been writing to for 3 years, who had described a world in such precise and loving detail that he had felt it like weather, who had made him laugh and think. And on one occasion, after a letter she had written in the aftermath of a difficult month, made him sit outside under the stars for a long while, feeling the particular way a person feels when they discover that someone else has named something they thought was unnameable. "I came because I think you are the most interesting person I have ever not met," he said. "And because looking at you right now I am finding out that not meeting you was a significant oversight on my part." Adelaide was very still. "Also," he said with that half-smile, "your coffee is considerably better than anything I have had since Cheyenne." She shook her head slowly and looked at the counter. Then she looked back up at him. "You can stay at the Dunmore boarding house," she said. "Mrs. Dunmore is reasonable and she doesn't ask too many questions." "That is a very practical response to what I just said," he said. "I am a very practical person," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been told so for 3 years, repeatedly, with great enthusiasm." She felt something in her relax. A thing she had not known was tightly wound until it loosened, and she thought, "He is exactly who the letters said he was, and he is something more too, something that the letters couldn't quite carry because it needs a voice and a face and the particular way he turns his hat in his hands when he is nervous, and I am entirely undone by it." "Go to the Dunmore," she said. "Get settled. Come back for supper. There is a good place, the Larsons' eating house on 2nd Street. "Supper," he said. "Supper," she confirmed. "You know, a meal in the evening, 2 people. I know what supper is, Adelaide. Then go find the boarding house." He picked up his hat and put it on. He looked at her once more at the door with those gray eyes, and then he was gone. Adelaide stood behind the counter. She pressed both hands flat on the wood surface. She took a breath. She thought, quite clearly and without surprise, "I am completely in love with this man." Then she thought, "I have been completely in love with this man for approximately 2 years and 3 months, and I have been lying to myself about it for all of that time, and that is a very Adelaide Winslow thing to have done." She went back to counting bolts of fabric. She lost count again at 23. The supper at Larson's eating house lasted until the owner, a large patient man named Bud Larson, began setting chairs on tables and coughing pointedly at them from across the room. They had eaten venison stew and cornbread, and 2 pieces of dried apple pie between them, and they had talked through all of it with the slightly wild energy of people who have 3 years of things to cover and suddenly have the chance. He told her about Consequent, the opinionated horse, who had in fact died the previous autumn after a very long and apparently still disputed argument with a fence post, and about whom he spoke with the kind of grief that is not quite grief, but is its close cousin, the feeling of losing a companion that understood you without requiring explanation. She told him about her parents, which she had not done much in the letters, told him about her mother's quick laugh and her father's steady hands, and the way the store had felt, after they were both gone, like a place she was maintaining rather than a place she was living in, until she decided, quite deliberately one winter morning, to make it hers instead. "How did you make it yours?" he asked. "I rearranged everything," she said. "My father had the dry goods on the west wall and the post section near the window. I moved the dry goods to the east wall and the post section to the back, and I put the letter-writing supplies in the front where the light is best. My father's customers complained for 6 months, and then they stopped complaining because the new arrangement was better," she said, "and that taught me that most complaints about change are complaints about the energy required to adjust to it, not about the change itself." He looked at her across the supper table. "You have a way of saying things," he said. "What way?" "Like they're final," he said. "Like you've thought about something until it's done and come out the other side with the answer and there's no point arguing with it. It's not unkind, it's just settled." "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It's one of my favorite things about your letters." That was the moment, she thought later, when the evening shifted. Not dramatically, not with any clear external sign, just a small internal tilting like a compass finding north. "I have letters of yours," she said. "I kept them all." "I know," he said. "You mentioned the cedar box once." "I wrapped them in blue ribbon," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's the kind of thing," he said, "that a man doesn't know how to respond to without saying something that either falls short or goes too far." "Then don't respond to it," she said. "I just wanted you to know." Bud Larson coughed again theatrically. They walked back through the main street of Harding Creek in the early dark, the lamps lit in the windows of the buildings along 2nd Street casting yellow squares on the dirt road. The wind had settled and the night was cold and clear, the stars extravagant above the dark line of the mountains. Grant walked beside her with his hands in his coat pockets, and at a certain point, without any particular decision being made, his arm came against hers and stayed there as they walked. "This is what I imagine," he said. "The town, the mountains, it looks like you described it." "I tried to be accurate," she said. "You were," he said, "but it's better in person." She looked up at the stars. "Most things are," she said. They reached the door of the store where she lived in the 2 back rooms. He stopped. She stopped. "Supper again tomorrow," he said. "Larson's doesn't do supper on Fridays," she said. "I'll cook. Come at 6. "You cook? Don't sound so surprised." "I'm not surprised," he said. "I knew you cooked. You mentioned the pie in October's letter." "The pie I gave away." "You said you baked it," he said. "Not who you baked it for." She looked at him. "I baked it," she said carefully, "because I was nervous about something. And then I felt foolish about being nervous and gave it to the Henleys." He was quiet for a moment. "Were you nervous about me?" he asked. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said, "considerably." He nodded slowly as if she had confirmed something he had been working out. "Adelaide," he said. "Grant," she said. "I have spent 3 years writing to you," he said. "And tonight I have spent the evening with you, and I want you to know that it is significantly harder to say the right thing out loud than it is to write it down. Because when you're writing you can revise, and here you are standing in front of me and there is no revising, and I want to say the right thing." "Say the true thing," she said. "That's generally the right one." He looked at her for a long moment, in the dark street with the stars overhead and the lamplight from the store window falling across the left side of his face. "I am very glad I came to Harding Creek," he said. It was quiet and simple, and it was, as she had said, the true thing. "I am very glad you did too," she said. He tipped his hat and walked up the street toward the Dunmore boarding house, and Adelaide went inside and stood in the lamplight of her store for a long time before she was calm enough to go to bed. She was not, it should be noted, calm enough to go to bed for quite some time. The days that followed were a gentle revolution. Grant had arrived in Harding Creek with no particular plan beyond arriving, which was, Adelaide pointed out to him, not really a plan at all. "It's the beginning of a plan," he said. "What is the rest of it?" "I don't know yet," he said. "I thought the beginning was the hard part." "The rest of the plan is generally also hard," she said. "You are a deeply reassuring person," he said. She laughed. They were sitting on the porch of the store in the early morning of a Friday, drinking coffee before the day began. He had taken to arriving early, before Cal Brannigan's tobacco run, bringing the coffee hot from the Dunmore's kitchen where Mrs. Dunmore had apparently taken an immediate liking to him, based on the strength of his appetite and his consistent politeness about it. The town, meanwhile, had noticed Grant Warren with the speed and completeness that small towns notice anything. By the 3rd day of his presence in Harding Creek, every person who came into the store had found a way to make an observation that was technically about something other than Adelaide's situation, but was entirely about it. Cal Brannigan, who Adelaide had believed was constitutionally uninterested in other people's business, turned out to have been merely uninterested in other people's business up until this particular moment, and had apparently been discussing it with at least 4 other men at the barber shop. Rosa Vasquez came in on Friday afternoon, saw Grant sitting in the back of the store reading a newspaper while Adelaide handled a customer, and looked at Adelaide with an expression of profound and entirely unnecessary satisfaction. "Don't," Adelaide said. "I said nothing," Rosa said. "You're about to." "I am thinking many things," Rosa said. "I am choosing to say very few of them." Grant looked up from his newspaper. "You must be Rosa Vasquez," he said. "Adelaide has written about you at considerable length." Rosa Vasquez turned to Adelaide. "He reads well," she said. "I know," Adelaide said. "And he is not bad looking," Rosa said, at a volume that was not quite private. "Rosa," Adelaide said. Grant had the good sense to look back at his newspaper, but his shoulders were doing something that suggested he was trying not to laugh. It was on that same Friday evening, over the supper Adelaide cooked, that Grant brought up Elias Cord again. "I wrote to him," he said. "Last week before I left Laramie, I told him the situation. He wrote back 3 days ago, which means he had the letter waiting for me when I arrived here." "What did he say?" Adelaide asked. Grant pulled a folded letter from his coat. "He says the technical violations cited against the Vasquez filing are, as you suspected, fabrications. The first 2 are based on an amended land office form that wasn't even in use at the time of the original filing, which means they couldn't possibly apply. The third is a boundary dispute that he believes can be resolved in Pete's favor with a proper survey." Adelaide felt something tight in her chest loosen. "He can help. He wants to come to Harding Creek," Grant said. "He says he has not had a decent fight in 2 years, and this one sounds promising." "I want to meet this man," Adelaide said. "You will like him," Grant said. "He is cantankerous and principled in a way that reminds me somewhat of you." "I am not cantankerous," Adelaide said. "You are occasionally cantankerous," Grant said. "It is one of your better qualities." She pointed her fork at him. He held up both hands in a gesture of peaceful surrender that was entirely unconvincing because he was still smiling. "Tell him to come," she said, "and tell him I will put him in contact with Pete Vasquez directly." Elias Cord arrived the following Tuesday, which was the earliest he could reasonably make it, on the afternoon stage from Cheyenne. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with a sharp face, a carefully maintained beard, and the kind of eyes that seemed to be calculating something at all times. He shook Adelaide's hand with genuine firmness, looked at Grant, looked back at Adelaide, and said, "I see." "You don't see anything," Grant said. "I see considerable," Elias Cord said. He settled in the Dunmore boarding house, and within 24 hours had reviewed every document Pete Vasquez had received from the consortium's lawyers, and was in, as he put it, an excellent mood about it. "This is sloppy work," he told them all, gathered in the back room of the store, Pete and Rosa sitting at the small table, Adelaide standing with her arms folded, Grant leaning against the shelving. "Not sloppy in a way that is hard to prove. Sloppy in a way that suggests whoever prepared these filings was confident they would not be challenged by anyone who knew what they were looking at. Because small ranchers generally can't afford a lawyer," Pete said. He was a quiet man, solid and careful, with a way of saying true things simply that Adelaide had always respected. "Exactly right," Elias said. "Which is precisely why this kind of operation works so well against the people it's designed to work against, and why it fails entirely the moment someone who knows what they're looking at actually looks at it." He spread the documents across the table. "I am going to file a formal response with the Territorial Land Office contesting each of these citations individually, and I am going to request a survey of the boundary in question, which I believe will be conducted by a surveyor who will find what I expect him to find, which is that your boundary is exactly where you filed it." "And the consortium?" Rosa asked. "If they continue to press after a proper survey and a formal contest, they will be in a position of defending bad faith litigation," Elias said. "Which is, legally speaking, a position that is considerably less comfortable than they are currently enjoying. He paused. I should also mention that there are 3 other families along this watershed that I suspect have received similar pressure. If any of them are willing to come forward, the pattern becomes significantly harder to ignore. Grant looked at Adelaide. She was already thinking it. I know those families, she said. I'll talk to them. Pete Vasquez looked across the table at Grant. Why are you doing this? He asked. Not unkindly, just directly. Grant was quiet for a moment. Because Adelaide told me about it, he said. And I told her I didn't look away from things. Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once and extended his hand across the table, and Grant took it. Rosa, who was watching all of this with her dark and perceptive eyes, looked at Adelaide with an expression that was entirely too knowing for Adelaide to deal with in a room full of people, so she looked at the documents on the table instead. The weeks that followed were full. Elias Cord was a remarkably efficient man when motivated, which he clearly was, and the filings went to the Territorial Land Office with a speed that seemed to genuinely surprise the consortium's lawyers when they received the formal responses. Adelaide talked to 2 of the 3 other families along the watershed, the Henrys, a black homesteader family who had been in the territory since 1873, and the Whitfields, an older couple whose son had taken over the ranch 3 years prior. Both agreed to have Elias review their situations. The 3rd family had already sold and moved north to Montana, and Adelaide felt that particular grief of a thing that can't be fixed, only acknowledged. Through all of it, Grant was present in a way that was entirely natural and entirely new. He was not a man who needed to be the loudest person in a room or the most important one. He helped Pete Vasquez refence a section of the southeastern boundary that needed it, not because anyone asked him to, but because he looked at it one morning when he and Pete were walking the property line and said, "That'll fall in the first real wind." And Pete said, "I know, I haven't had time." And Grant said, "I have time," and that was that. He helped Cal Brannigan move a load of timber one afternoon that Cal had been trying to organize for 3 weeks and couldn't manage alone. He spent an entire morning one day helping Adelaide reorganize the back storeroom, which had needed reorganizing for 2 years, and which Grant pointed out with great precision and some humor was organized on a system that seemed to be proximity to where Adelaide was standing when she first received each item. "That is not a system," he said. "It is an intuitive system," she said. "It is chaos described charitably," he said. "I know where everything is," she said. "Do you?" "Mostly," she said, and he laughed and they reorganized the storeroom together. And by the end of the morning the system made actual sense, and they were covered in dust and arguing cheerfully about whether vinegar and oil of cloves should be in the same section, a debate that was entirely unimportant and entirely wonderful. It was in the storeroom, in fact, on that dusty, cluttered, ordinary morning, that he kissed her for the first time. They had been debating the vinegar and she had turned to make her point and found him closer than expected, and the debate stopped, and the silence was of the particular quality that is full rather than empty, and he said, quietly, "May I?" And she said, "Yes," and he kissed her once carefully, the way you handle something you are not entirely sure is real yet. When he stepped back she looked at him and said with complete truthfulness, "I have been waiting to do that for considerably longer than 3 years, although I didn't know it for most of that time." "How long have you known?" he asked. "About 2 years and 3 months, she said. He looked at her. "February of '77, he said. "The letter about the quilt." She blinked. "How did you know that?" "Because that was the same month I knew," he said. She absorbed that. "Grant Warren," she said slowly. "Are you telling me we have both known for over 2 years and neither of us said it?" "We are not efficient people," he said. "I am extremely efficient," she said, "professionally. In matters of sentiment I am apparently terrible." "We are both terrible," he said. "It's something we have in common." "We have an alarming number of things in common," she said. "I noticed that early on." "So did I," he said. She reached up and brushed the dust off his shoulder from the storeroom, a gesture so domestic and natural that she did it before she thought about it, and then thought about it immediately after, and he caught her hand as she lowered it and held it loosely, like it was a perfectly normal thing to do. It was, she thought, the best morning she could remember having in a long time. The land office sent a surveyor in late May. He was a professional man from Cheyenne named Horace Blythe, who took his work seriously, and spent 2 full days walking the Vasquez property with instruments and careful attention. His report came back in early June and confirmed, as Elias had predicted, that the boundary in question was precisely where Pete Vasquez had originally filed. The third citation, the one about the amended form, had already been dismissed by the land office itself upon Elias' formal challenge, as the error in its application was too obvious to defend. The consortium's lawyers filed 2 more objections over the following weeks, and Elias batted them away with what Adelaide privately thought was a degree of pleasure that bordered on unseemly, but which she could not bring herself to fault. The Henry family's case went similarly. The pressure on the Whitfield property turned out to be based on an outright forgery in the consortium's documentation, which Elias identified with the calm of a man who has been waiting for exactly this kind of thing, and which he referred to the territorial prosecutor's office with a detailed letter that Adelaide helped him draft. The prosecutor was a man named Armand Hollister, who was, by general reputation, not entirely above the influence of large cattle interests, but who was also, by equally general reputation, not interested in being made a fool of, and the combination of Elias' documentation and the very clear chain of evidence made ignoring it an unpleasant option. It did not go to trial in the end. The Hollow Creek Consortium's leadership, faced with a forgery charge and a formal inquiry from the Territorial Land Office, made a legal settlement with the Henry family in August, acknowledging the validity of their claim and paying a modest sum in recognition of the disruption caused. The Vasquez situation was formally resolved in September with an official reaffirmation of their water rights. It was not a complete victory in the sense that the larger injustice, the broad pattern of powerful interests using legal manipulation to pressure small landowners, remained intact and would continue in 100 other places. Adelaide knew that. She did not pretend otherwise, but Pete and Rosa kept their land, and the Henry family kept theirs, and Adelaide took a copy of the formal resolutions and put them in the cedar box alongside Grant's letters, because both of them were things she intended to keep. Elias Cord, when the last filing was done, sat in the back room of the store and drank a cup of coffee with Adelaide and Grant and said, "I believe I'll stay in Harding Creek for a while." "There is not much call for a claims attorney here," Adelaide said. "There is more than you'd think," Elias said, "and I like the coffee." He did stay, as it turned out, for the better part of the following year, and set up a small practice in a room he rented above the barber shop, and was cantankerous and principled in exactly the way Grant had described, and became, over time, one of Adelaide's most valued friends in the way that people who are too honest to be comfortable are always, eventually, valued by people who appreciate honesty. It was an evening in July, the long, golden July of the Wyoming Territory, where the days last until the mountains swallow the sun, and the air carries the smell of pine and dry grass, that Grant asked Adelaide to marry him. She was closing the store. He had come in after supper, as he did most evenings now, to help her count out the day's money and lock the shutters. It was an ordinary task that had become, over the weeks, something she looked forward to, the quiet and comfortable ordinariness of it, which was different from the letters and from the charged, wondering quality of those first days, and was in its own way more significant. He waited until the last shutter was latched and turned to find her looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, which was unusual, because by July Grant Warren had become reasonably fluent in Adelaide Winslow's expressions. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just looking at you. "You look at me like you're reading a letter," he said, "like you're trying to find what's between the lines." "I'm not," she said. "There are no lines with you. You're the most straightforward person I know." "That is not entirely a compliment." "It is from me," she said. "I have spent a great deal of my life dealing with people who are not straightforward. It is a quality I value enormously." He was quiet. Then he said, "Adelaide." The way he said it, just her name, was the same way he'd said it in the letters when he was about to say something important. "Grant," she said. "I have been in Harding Creek for 3 months," he said. "I know." "I came here because of you," he said, "which you know. And I've been here for 3 months, and it has been the most settled I have felt in as long as I can remember, which you also probably know because you are observant in a way that occasionally unnerves me." "It doesn't usually unnerve you," she said. "Right now it slightly does," he said, "because I am trying to say something and I am not sure I am saying it well." "You're saying it fine," she said. "I don't want to leave Harding Creek," he said. "I have been thinking about this for several weeks, and I have been trying to determine whether it is the town I don't want to leave or you, and I have concluded that it is you, and the town is part of it because the town is part of you. But if you moved the store to some other place entirely, I would follow it there, which means I would follow you, which means the question I want to ask you is whether that would be an acceptable arrangement." Adelaide looked at him. "You are asking whether you can stay," she said. "I am asking whether you would be willing to let me stay in a rather more permanent capacity than a boarder at the Dunmore," he said. "I am asking, Adelaide, whether you would marry me." The store was quiet. Outside, the creek ran over its stones and the cottonwoods rustled in the last of the evening wind. "I wrote you a letter once," she said, "in February of 1879 that took me 4 drafts to get right. And even after the 4th draft I wasn't sure I'd said it right. And what I was trying to say was, essentially, what you just said to me. That you wanted to marry me," he said. "That I didn't want to stop," she said. "Whatever this was. That I didn't want it to be letters forever, not because the letters weren't enough, because they were more than enough, but because there should be more. There should be all of it." "So," he said. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He crossed the room and she met him halfway, and when he kissed her this time it was nothing like the careful, wondering first kiss in the storeroom. It was certain and warm, and full of 3 years of letters and 3 months of ordinary evenings. And when they stepped apart, she had her hands on either side of his face, and he was looking at her like she was the most remarkable thing he had ever seen, which was, she thought, exactly how she felt about him. They were married in September of 1879, which was the same week the Vasquez water rights were formally confirmed, which felt like the right kind of coincidence. The ceremony was held outside, behind the general store, in the yard where the cottonwoods leaned toward the creek, because there was no church of proper size, and also because Adelaide wanted the mountains in the view. Rosa Vasquez made Adelaide a dress from a length of ivory cotton that had been in the store's inventory since Adelaide's father's time, and which Adelaide had been saving without knowing what she was saving it for. Elias Cord, who had not been asked to speak but who had opinions regardless, gave a toast at the supper afterward in the Larsons' eating house that managed to be both genuinely moving and extensively sarcastic, which was exactly right. Cal Brannigan attended, sat in the back, ate 2 pieces of wedding cake and pronounced the whole affair decent enough, which from Cal was essentially a standing ovation. Pete Vasquez shook Grant's hand at the supper and said, "You're a good man." Grant said, "I know some good people. It rubs off." The boarding house at the Dunmore was not, of course, a permanent arrangement for a married man. In October, Grant began building an addition to the back of the store. He had, it emerged, a genuine aptitude for construction that Adelaide had not known about and which he had not mentioned in any letter, because, as he put it, "You never asked what I could do with my hands." She pointed out that she could have asked, and he said, "I know. I was waiting to show you." She thought this was the most infuriating and the most delightful answer she had ever heard from him, and she told him so, and he put down his hammer and kissed her in the half-built room that would become their kitchen, with sawdust in his hair and a cold October wind coming through the open frame where the window would be. They lived in those rooms behind the store through their first winter as a married couple, and it was the best winter Adelaide had ever spent, which was something she had not expected to say, because Wyoming winters were not objectively pleasant and she had spent 23 of them by that point and had a realistic understanding of what they entailed. But there was a difference, she found, between enduring a winter and spending it with someone. The cold had the same temperature. The snow came with the same weight. But the evenings were different, and the mornings were different, and the way the lamplight moved across the kitchen table when they sat together after supper was entirely different, and she thought that this was what she had been writing toward without knowing it, for 3 years of letters, this specific ordinary warmth. Grant took work where he could find it through the fall and winter. He had skills beyond cattle driving, the surveying he'd mentioned in his letters, and a general mechanical aptitude that found a consistent market in a region where equipment broke regularly, and the nearest proper mechanic was a significant distance away. He repaired the water pump at the Vasquez Ranch, rebuilt the axle on the Henley's wagon, and spent 3 weeks in November helping a rancher named Davies build a proper barn to replace the one that had collapsed in an early snowstorm. None of this made him wealthy, but all of it made him, as Adelaide observed, someone the county was glad to have, which in a place like Harding Creek was its own currency. He was also, Adelaide discovered, a man who could be still, which was something she had not known she needed until she had it. He could sit on the porch in the early morning with his coffee and the mountains in the distance and be entirely quiet for long stretches, not in the uncomfortable way of a person who can't think of anything to say, but in the comfortable way of a person who has made peace with silence and invites you into it. She had spent so many years filling silence because the silence of an empty store and an empty house had felt like an accusation of something. With Grant, the silence was furniture. It was simply where you lived. She told him this one evening in December, watching the snow fall on the street outside the store window. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I have been alone for a long time, long enough that I stopped noticing the noise it makes when you're alone and you're trying not to be. When you're with someone it goes quiet. I didn't know what that was going to feel like. I'm glad I know now." She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. The snow fell on Harding Creek, soft and steady. By the spring of 1880, Adelaide knew she was expecting a child. She told Grant on a Tuesday morning early in March before the store opened. She set 2 cups of coffee on the counter and waited for him to sit down and then said, quite directly, because she was Adelaide Winslow and directness was simply how she operated, "I believe we are going to have a baby." He looked at her. He was very still for a moment. Then his face did something she had not entirely seen before, opened completely in a way that was slightly staggering to witness, and he stood up from the stool and crossed the counter to her and took her face in both hands and pressed his forehead to hers. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I feel fine," she said. "I feel entirely normal, actually, which the Lady's Almanac assures me is not going to last but is currently the case." "When?" he said. "September," she said. "I think September." He pulled her close and held her, the way you hold something that is both sturdy and precious at once, and she felt his hands on her back and thought, again, as she had thought so many times in the past year, that the difference between a life maintained and a life lived was exactly this: the specific warmth of a specific person who was yours and you were his. "A baby," he said, into her hair. "Apparently we are very practical people in most respects," she said, "and less practical than we thought in others." He laughed, and the laugh was the very best one she knew, deep and genuine and real. The news moved through Harding Creek at the usual speed of such news in small towns, which was to say that by Thursday Rosa Vasquez already knew and had opinions about it, and Cal Brannigan knew and was publicly indifferent and privately, Adelaide suspected, pleased. Elias Cord, who had been in Harding Creek long enough to feel proprietary about the town's developments, showed up at the store on Friday morning with a bottle of good apple cider and the information that he had once delivered a baby in a blizzard in Colorado, and was available if needed. Adelaide thanked him and told him she hoped it would not come to that. The months of that pregnancy were good months. Not easy months, because Adelaide continued to run the store, continued to organize the letters, continued to file the regular correspondence with the land office that she now did on behalf of multiple families in the county. And doing all of that with the increasing demands of a growing pregnancy was not, she would readily admit, a simple thing. But they were good. Grant was present in the specific way she had come to rely on, attentive without hovering, helpful without taking over, capable of figuring out what she needed before she had quite worked it out herself, which was a quality she found both impressive and occasionally irritating in the way that being anticipated can be irritating to people who are used to managing things independently. "I was going to do that," she said one afternoon in June when he had rearranged the lower shelves of the store so she didn't have to bend as far. "I know," he said. "I did it anyway." "I am perfectly capable," she said. "Of everything," he agreed. "I did it anyway." She stood at the counter and looked at him. "Grant," she said. "Adelaide," he said. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. He added after a moment, "You say thank you as though it surprised you." "It does sometimes," she said, "when it's that natural, when someone just does a thing without making an occasion of it." "It's not an occasion," he said. "You're carrying our child and the bottom shelves needed reorganizing. It's a logical sequence of events." "You are," she said, "a very good man." He looked at her steadily. "I am a man who is very glad he came to Harding Creek," he said. "You keep coming back to that," she said. "Because it's still the truest thing I know," he said. The baby arrived in September, as expected, on a Thursday morning, with a brisk autumn wind coming down from the mountains. The labor was hard and long, the way labors are, but Adelaide was attended by Mrs. Clara Rhodes, who served as the closest thing to a Dr. Harding Creek had for most common purposes, and by Rosa Vasquez, who held Adelaide's hand for approximately 6 consecutive hours with the steady calm of a woman who has seen difficult things and knows that steady calm is the most useful gift one person can give another. Grant was outside because that was how it was done, and Elias Cord sat with him on the porch of the store for most of the morning in the brisk September air, and they did not talk much, but the company was there, which mattered. When Mrs. Rhodes came to the door and said, "Mr. Warren, you have a son," Grant stood up very quickly and went inside. The boy was small and red and furious and entirely perfect. Grant held him with the careful certainty of a man who has held many fragile things and knows the correct grip, and Adelaide watched her husband's face as he looked at their son and felt something so complete and full that she did not have words for it, which was all right, because not everything needed words. They named him Thomas, after Adelaide's father. Thomas Grant Warren, born September 18, 1880 in Harding Creek, Wyoming Territory. "Hello, Thomas," Grant said quietly to the small, fierce face. "We have been expecting you." Adelaide closed her eyes. The wind moved through the cottonwoods outside the window. The months and years that followed were full in every sense of the word. Thomas was a loud and determined and remarkably strong-willed child, who seemed to have inherited equal parts of both his parents, and was thus, as Elias Cord observed when Thomas was approximately 14 months old, and had systematically dismantled every arrangement of goods on the lower shelves of the store for the 3rd time that week, an organizational challenge. Grant had, by the time Thomas arrived, established himself firmly as a man of Harding Creek in a way that went beyond Adelaide's original imagining. He had taken on a small surveying contract with the Territorial Land Office, the same land office Adelaide had been corresponding with and occasionally battling for years, which was a development that afforded both of them a particular satisfaction, and the work brought him into the county regularly and usefully. He had also, quietly, become someone that the smaller ranchers and homesteaders in the area came to with practical problems, because he was good at solving them and did not make a show of it. Adelaide continued to run the store and post office with the same thoroughness she always had. She had added a lending section in the front window, a small collection of books she had assembled over the years, which she lent out on the honor system to anyone who wanted them. It was not a library in any official sense, but it functioned as one, and the honor ledger, as she called it, was one of the things she was most privately proud of, because it had operated for 3 years without a single book failing to come back. The justice work continued too, quieter now but steady. Elias Cord's practice had grown into something genuine, and he and Adelaide had developed a working system where she identified the situations, based on the letters and the people, and the particular knowledge that comes from running the post office in a place for years, and he assessed the legal dimension. They had brought 3 more cases to the land office's attention and resolved 2 of them favorably. The third was ongoing, a complex situation involving a railroad right-of-way claim that had displaced a Mexican family named the Ochoas, and which was harder because the railroad had better lawyers and more patience than the Hollow Creek Consortium had had. Elias had not given up on it. Adelaide had not given up on it. They would not. In the spring of 1883, Adelaide discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Grant the same way she had told him the first time, directly, over coffee, on a Tuesday morning. He reacted the same way he had the first time, with that complete, unguarded opening of his face, and she thought as she had thought before that of all the things she had come to love about him, this quality of being entirely present in moments of joy, of not moderating or containing the happiness but simply feeling it fully and without self-consciousness, was among the very best. "Thomas will be 3 in September," she said. "He will be an excellent older brother," Grant said. "He already has opinions about how everyone around him should behave. Having a younger sibling will give him a proper outlet for them." "You say that as though it's a comfortable prospect," she said. "I say it as though it's true," he said. "Thomas is going to be an excellent person. He is currently an exhausting person. Those things are not mutually exclusive." Their daughter arrived in October of 1883. They named her Clara, after Adelaide's mother, whose quick laugh Adelaide heard sometimes in the sound of Thomas's laughter and hoped to hear again. Clara Warren arrived on a clear, cold October morning, quieter than Thomas had been but no less alert, with Adelaide's dark hair and Grant's gray eyes, and she looked around the room from the moment she arrived as though she was taking stock of her new situation and finding it, on balance, acceptable. "Hello, Clara," Adelaide said. "I have been expecting you too." The years settled into the shape of a life that was ordinary and extraordinary in the way that all real lives are, both at once, each thing individually unremarkable and together making something that was entirely particular and entirely theirs. Thomas grew into a boy who was relentlessly curious and physically fearless and deeply affectionate in the private way of children who are also intensely proud, who would hug you fiercely when no one was watching and maintain a studied nonchalance about it in public. He helped in the store from the time he could reliably carry things without dropping them. He took to reading with a focus that reminded Adelaide of herself and a breadth that, she suspected, came from the lending section and its honor ledger, which Thomas had used so extensively that Adelaide had started adding books specifically to his known interests. Clara was different and entirely herself. She was interested in the land in a way that was almost tactile, spent hours with Pete Vasquez learning about soil and water and the particular language of the range, came home with muddy boots and specific knowledge about the drainage patterns of the Hollow Creek watershed at the age of 7 that would have been remarkable in a grown surveyor. She also had, from a young age, a quality of stillness that Grant recognized as his own and Adelaide recognized as something else, a watchfulness, a patience, a willingness to wait for the right moment that would serve her well in ways neither of them could yet predict. In the fall of 1885, Grant brought home a horse named after, a 3-year-old gray mare with a decided personality, whom he had acquired in partial payment for a survey job outside Laramie. After was not, he admitted, as opinionated as Consequent had been, but she was working on it. Adelaide had, at this point in her life, become reasonably fluent in horses as a category of information. She walked around after in the yard behind the store, and after watched her with the patient, assessing intelligence of horses who know they are being evaluated and have views about it. "She'll do," Adelaide said. "High praise," Grant said. "It is," she said. "I don't give it easily." "I know," he said. "To horses or anything else." She looked at him over the back of the gray mare. He was 40 now, his dark hair beginning to show gray at the temples, the weathering of his face deeper and more settled, and he was, she thought, exactly the person she had been reading in the letters, exactly who he had told her he was, who had walked through her door on a cold April morning and had not left. And she was, she thought, still completely in love with him in a way that was daily and particular and not at all diminished by the years. "Grant," she said. "Adelaide," he said. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the letters." He waited. "We should give them to Thomas and Clara," she said. "Eventually, when they're old enough to read them properly, all of them, both sides." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he asked, not in challenge but in genuine curiosity. "Because it is the story of how we started," she said. "And because I think it would be good for them to see that people can know each other deeply before they are in the same room, that the words you put into something matter, that paying attention to a person, really paying attention, is a form of love." He looked at her across the horse's back. "That's a beautiful thing to want to give them," he said. "I want to give them many beautiful things," she said. "That's one of them." After turned her head and looked at Adelaide with what appeared to be approval. "Even the horse agrees," Grant said. "All the reasonable parties agree," Adelaide said. He laughed and came around the horse and kissed her in the yard, with the mountains in the distance and the cottonwoods turning yellow in the early fall. And Thomas shouted from the back door of the store that supper was ready, and did they want him to tell it to the horse too? And Clara appeared behind him and said, with the precise logic of a 7-year-old, that the horse ate grass and not supper, so it would not be relevant information for the horse. Adelaide pulled back from Grant and called to her children that they were coming, and Grant's hand was warm in hers as they walked back to the door, and the kitchen smelled of the stew on the stove and the wood smoke from the fire, and the lamplight was warm in the windows of the house that had been a store and then a home, that had been a place she maintained, and then a place she lived, and the sound of her children arguing pleasantly about the dietary habits of horses was the finest music she knew. She thought, as she crossed the threshold of her own door with her husband's hand in hers, about the first letter she had ever written to Grant Warren in February of 1877, alone in the lamplight after the store was closed. She thought about the 23-year-old woman she had been, practical and capable and quietly burning, writing to an unknown address about cottonwood trees and a Comanche star quilt, not knowing what she was starting, only knowing she couldn't leave the silence entirely unanswered. She thought about what it had led to, all of it. The cedar box wrapped in blue ribbon, the gray eyes she had not expected. The 3 years of letters that had built something so solid that when it became real it did not feel like transformation but like arrival. She thought about Harding Creek in the spring of 1879, and a door opening, and a man standing in the light with his hat in his hands. She thought, "I was waiting for you before I knew I was waiting for anything." She thought, and you came. The kitchen was warm and the children were loud and Grant was beside her. And somewhere in the store the cedar box sat with its blue ribbon intact. And inside it were the words that had built this life, every careful page of them, the record of two people paying attention to each other across distance and time until the distance closed entirely, and only the time remained, generous and continuing, ahead of them. Adelaide Winslow, who had written letters for 3 years to a man she had never met, set the table for supper in the home they had made together, and was not, for the first time in a long time, waiting for anything at all. She had everything she had been writing toward. It was, in every sense that mattered, exactly enough. The winter that year was long and generous with its snow, the kind that came in thick and steady, and settled the world into a quiet that Adelaide had always found, since Grant and the children, comforting rather than isolating. Thomas turned 5 in September, and had taken it upon himself to learn the names of every mountain visible from the store's front porch, a project he prosecuted with the serious energy he brought to most things. Clara at 2.5 was already trying to follow Pete Vasquez around the Vasquez ranch on her short, determined legs, and Rosa had taken to picking her up and carrying her on one hip while she worked, calling her little surveyor, which was accurate in spirit if not yet in practice. Elia's court had, in the fall of 1885, finally won the Ochoa case. It had taken 2 years and more filings than he had originally expected, and one appeal to the territorial court that had gone badly before going, eventually, well. But the railroad's right-of-way claim against the Ochoa family property was formally dismissed, and the family received compensation for the damage to their fencing and outbuildings that had occurred during the disputed period. Elias had come to the store to tell Adelaide in person, arriving at 9 in the morning with the look of a man who has just put down something very heavy. "You did it," Adelaide said. "We did it," Elias said. "You found them. You documented the pressure. You wrote the original complaint that got me the introduction." "I wrote a letter," Adelaide said. "You practiced law for 2 years. You wrote a very good letter," Elias said. "Which is what you do." She had, in fact, continued to write letters, not in the way she had written to Grant, not the long, searching, building kind, but in the practical, purposeful way of someone who understood what words on paper could do when properly directed. She wrote to the territorial government on behalf of families she knew. She wrote to newspapers in Cheyenne and in Denver when something needed to be made visible that the local authorities would have preferred invisible. She wrote to the Women's Christian Temperance Union not because she was particularly temperance-minded, but because they had a correspondence network that could carry information across the territory quickly, and were, she had found, reliably outraged by injustice in a way that was practically useful. Grant called her the most effective letter writer in the Wyoming Territory. She said that was an unverifiable claim. He said he was willing to verify it if anyone wanted to argue. Nobody argued. In the spring of 1886, 2 things happened. The first was that the Wyoming Territory elected a new territorial governor, whose administration took a noticeably more serious interest in land fraud than the previous one had, a development that Elias Cord greeted with the particular pleasure of a man who has been right about something for years and now has evidence to wave around, and which Adelaide recognized as the result of the slow, patient accumulation of documented cases and written complaints and letters to newspapers that she and Elias and others had been building for years. It was not a complete victory. It was not even, strictly speaking, a victory. It was a shift in direction, a slight change in the angle of a ship that would matter enormously over the long miles ahead. Adelaide understood that. She recorded it in the ledger she kept at the back of the store, where she had been writing down the outcomes of every case and complaint she had been involved with since she started, because she believed in keeping records, and because records were, in the end, the truest kind of letter, the ones that told the story to whoever came after. The second thing that happened in the spring of 1886 was that Rosa Vasquez brought her daughter Inez to the store one Friday morning, a small and extremely decisive girl of 4, and Clara Warren, who was 2.5, looked at Inez across the floor of the general store with the gravity of someone encountering an important person, and Inez looked back with the same expression. And from that moment forward, they were inseparable in the way of certain children who recognize something essential in each other and arrange their worlds around it. Rosa and Adelaide watched this happen from across the counter. "Like their mothers," Rosa said. "Their mothers are separated by a counter and a profession," Adelaide said. "Their mothers are inseparable," Rosa corrected. "The counter is furniture. The profession is yours. Neither of those is a separation." Adelaide considered this. "No," she said, "I suppose not." She looked at her daughter on the floor with Rose's daughter, and she thought about what had started all of this. A letter to an unknown address, the refusal to leave a silence entirely unanswered, and the long chain of things that had followed from that. Grant and the cedar box and Thomas and Clara and Elias, and the Vasquez family, and the Henrys and the Ochoas, and the new governor and the records she kept at the back of the store. She thought about the woman she had been at 20 years old, taking over the counter from her father, and whether that woman would have understood what she had become at 30 years old. She thought she would have. She thought that woman had always known, in the specific, stubborn way of people who cannot look away, that this was the direction she was walking, toward all of it, even when she couldn't see it yet. The store was warm. The children were laughing on the floor. Rosa was talking about a new quilt she was making, a variation on the Comanche star pattern with a border she had been designing for 2 years. The cottonwoods outside the window were going green in the spring, that first green that Grant had once described as the thing he thought about when he thought about home. He came in at noon, as he often did when he was working in town, and hung his coat on the hook by the door and poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, and settled onto Cal Brannigan's stool, which was now Grant's stool in the general understanding of Harding Creek, though Cal still used it on his morning tobacco visits, and Grant moved without comment to the other one on those occasions, because some things did not need to be negotiated. He looked at Adelaide across the counter. She looked at him. "Good morning," she asked. "Good morning," he said. The survey at the Davies property took longer than expected because Davies had questions about his eastern boundary that required me to rewalk it, but the answers were what he wanted them to be, which was fortunate. And the Holloway fence needs replacing, which Holloway knows and I told him, and which he took better than expected. He usually takes things badly. He was in a better mood than usual, Grant said. His daughter's baby came 3 days ago, a boy. "I should send something," Adelaide said. She was already thinking about what the store had, what the right thing would be. "You always send something," he said. "I always should," she said. He drank his coffee. Outside, the April sun was warm on the street. Through the window, Harding Creek looked like itself, the buildings along 2nd Street, the mountains beyond, the creek visible in a glimmer at the south end of town, and the cottonwoods coming green along its banks. "Adelaide," Grant said. "Grant," she said. "I was thinking," he said, about what you said about the letters, about giving them to Thomas and Clara." She waited. "I think we should write them one," he said, "together. One letter that explains what the letters were before we give them the box, so they have the context." She looked at him. This was a Grant Warren idea, which meant it had been sitting with him for a while, turning over quietly in his mind the way his ideas did until they were ready. "A letter to our children," she said, "about what we wrote to each other. About why it mattered," he said. "About what it taught us, about what letters can be." She thought about it. "Tonight," she said. "After supper, we'll write it together." "Tonight," he agreed. Clara had fallen asleep on the store floor with her head on the edge of Inez Vasquez's coat, which Inez had apparently offered for this purpose, and was now sitting beside it with the protective air of someone guarding something important. Thomas was in the back room trying to reorganize a shelf that did not, by any objective standard, need reorganizing, and making a noise about it that suggested it was going well by his lights and no one else's. Rosa caught Adelaide's eye, and they both, quietly, did not say anything, which was the conversation between people who have been friends long enough that some things are said in silence. Adelaide turned back to the counter. She straightened the mail she'd sorted that morning. She looked at the shelf behind her where the letters came in and went out, the daily traffic of words between people, the ordinary miracle of it. She thought about a young woman in the winter of 1877, sitting alone in the lamplight after the store was closed, picking up a pen. She thought about the specific courage of that, which she had not known at the time was courage, only known was necessary. She thought about the voice she had imagined for 3 years and the man it belonged to, sitting on the other side of the counter with his coffee, the gray eyes she had not expected, the hat he turned in his hands when he was nervous. She thought, the best thing I ever did was write to someone I had never met, she thought, and the best thing that ever happened to me walked through my own door. The afternoon light shifted through the store window, warm and golden. Outside, Harding Creek went about its daily life. Inside, the store smelled of coffee and cedar and the faint memory of letters. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every particular, everything. And late that evening, after the supper dishes were cleared and the children were sleeping, Adelaide and Grant Warren sat together at the kitchen table with one lamp burning between them and a sheet of good paper set out flat, and he dipped the pen and handed it to her, and she wrote the first line, and he wrote the second, and they went back and forth that way, taking turns the way you do when something belongs to both of you equally, writing a letter to their children about the 3 years of letters, about the cedar box and the blue ribbon, about the sound of a voice she had missed before she'd heard it, about a man who had described her to herself, and a woman who had told a stranger, about the light on the cottonwood trees. They wrote, "We are telling you this because we believe in words, because we believe that paying attention to another person, really paying attention, is the most important thing you can do, and it begins with listening, which begins with reading, which begins with the willingness to be present in what someone is trying to tell you. We wrote to each other for 3 years before we met, and by the time we met, we knew each other. Not perfectly, not completely, but in the ways that matter, the things a person reaches for when they are honest, the things they protect when they are careful, the things they reveal when they trust you enough. We knew those things about each other, and when the door opened, it was not a meeting, it was a recognition. We hope you will have that. We hope in whatever form it takes for you, in whatever world you live in, you will have someone you can be honest with, someone whose words you keep because they are worth keeping, someone who knows you without requiring you to be smaller than you are. We kept each other's words. We are giving them to you now. They are where they always were, in the cedar box, wrapped in blue ribbon." They signed it together, Adelaide and Grant Warren, Harding Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1886. She folded it carefully and set it on top of the cedar box. Grant put out the lamp. The mountain dark was full of stars, and the creek ran its quiet music along the edge of town, and the cottonwoods stood in the silver dark ready for morning. And in the house that had been a store and was now a home, everyone who belonged there was exactly where they were supposed to be.